Good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Gaston Alonso, and I am the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College. And I am thrilled to welcome you to today's event. So thank you so much for being here. Today, we celebrate the publication of the Asian Caribbean in the Caribbean Diaspora, Essays on Migration, Identity, and Literary and Cultural Representations, a groundbreaking new volume edited by Brooklyn College's Aleah N. Ranjitsingh. So please, let's give Professor Ranjitsingh and the contributors to the volume who are joining us today a big round of virtual applause. Now, I am thrilled for this event for two reasons. First, Professor Ranjitsingh is part of the Wolf Institute's family. It's part of the family. For the last 2 years, Aleah has served on the board of advisors to the Institute. But beyond that, she is essential to the work that we do at the Institute. She's essential to the soul of the Institute. And so it is great for us to be able to celebrate one of our own. Second, I find this volume to be so important in the groundbreaking work that it is doing, not only in remapping the Asian diaspora by focusing on the Caribbean, as well as acknowledging the Asian population of the Caribbean, but also in centering Caribbean people of Asian descent as knowledge producers, as cultural makers, as historical agents, right? Now, I'm not going to give away, any spoilers. I will leave the authors of the volume to do that. But before we start, just 4 quick announcements. First, this event is being recorded, and the recording will be available in the Wolves Institute YouTube channel. 2, as we proceed, we will be sharing speakers' biographies in the chat and on the screen. 3, we will leave time at the end for comments and for questions on topics that are raised by our speakers. And 4, I must thank our co-sponsors, the Asian American Asian Research Institute at CUNY, CUNY, the Departments of Africana Studies, Political Science, and Puerto Rican and Latinx Studies, the Program in Caribbean Studies, BCAP, and the Women's Center at Brooklyn College. Thank you for your support. And with that, let me introduce Professor Ranjitsingh. Aleah Ranjitsingh is Assistant Professor of Africana Studies Department and the Caribbean Studies Program at Brooklyn College. She has published in the Journal of Intercultural Studies, the Caribbean Journal of International Relations and Diplomacy, and the Caribbean Review of Gender Studies. She is the co-author of Dougla in the 21st Century, Adding to the Mix, a study of race and mixed-race Dougla identity in the Caribbean Diaspora, 2021, and the editor of the volume that we celebrate today, The Asian Caribbean in the Caribbean Diaspora. And yes, she is a member of the Board of Advisors of the Wolf Institute at Brooklyn College. Aleah, we are so proud of you, and the entire board wanted me to let you know that tonight. With that, congratulations, and the microphone is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gaston, for your introduction. Thank you to you, and then, the Wolf Institute. Thank you to Kiana Benjamin, the administrator, who is not here this evening. I miss her. Also, thanks to Camilla Renteria, the Wolf's intern this year, who did these very lovely flyers, and I do have to frame one and keep it in my office for today's book talk. Thank you to Ari for supporting my work, and also to the Betty Lee Sung Endowment Fund, which allowed me to complete my own chapter in this edited collection. Thank you to BCAP, as well as my department, the Africana Studies Department and the Caribbean Studies Program, as well as, and I guess I'm repeating you now, Gaston, but thank you to the Departments of Political Science, PEARLS, and also the Women's Center. Thank you to my colleagues who are here. I see from the participant list. Thank you all so much for showing up. I see people from my department, other departments, other people I work with on campus. I actually see someone who many, many years ago, when I thought about doing a second master's in women's studies, I went up to the Minnesota State University and I met with this person who hosted me for a day. And that person is here. Thank you so much. And I see some of students. Thank you all so much. And also thank you to the contributors who are here, who made time, to be here with me tonight to discuss this collection. And I'm very happy to celebrate this collection. It is, like a love story to the Caribbean for me. If you know me at Brooklyn College, you probably heard my Caribbean accent, my Trinidadian accent, which I cannot hide. I'm always talking about the Caribbean. I talk about the Caribbean a lot. And, I am a Caribbean scholar from, this rich legacy of, Caribbean scholars and scholarship. And Professor Rhoda Raddock, who would serve on my PhD committee at the University of the West Indies, and who I would speak to as I prepared my job talk for this job that I'm in right now. And I spoke on her 2014 article, Radical Caribbean Social Thought, Race, Class Identity, and the Post-Colonial Nation, where she discusses the legacy of radical Caribbean intellectual thought emerging and defined by the colonial context of the Caribbean space by Caribbean people in the Caribbean and the diaspora. She said these have drawn and critiqued the philosophies and theories of Pan-Africanism, Marxism, socialism, and feminism. And in this way, what I've maintained in my scholarship and in my teaching is that the Caribbean is an epistemological space, and Caribbean people in the Caribbean and the diaspora, we are knowledge producers. And in fact, this edited collection is dedicated to all Caribbean people, but 3 Caribbean people in particular, I guess 2.5 Caribbean people. If you, have seen the book, maybe not the physical copy, but the ebook was bought by the Brooklyn College Library. And I'm so thankful to the library. I'm so thankful to Helen Georges at the library. In the dedication, I dedicate the book to my daughter, Hope, who I call my Caribbean baby because she's all mix of Caribbean things, even with her American accent, right? Also to my grandmother, Verena Shahida Ranjitsingh, who was this Indo-Trinidadian woman who would tell me all about her travels. And, she was the first one to push me to dream about seeing the world, seeing all of it. And also to my late PhD supervisor, Professor Norman Gervin, who I wish was here today because we have so much to talk about what's happening in the Caribbean today. So I so wish he was here. But, I dedicate this book to him. And I am going to share my screen with you all. Shortly. Let me just get to the first slide. I'm sorry. You know how these things go. So I'm going to be sharing my screen now. It should be shared now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. And then just make it bigger. Yeah. So this collection is entitled, as we know, The Asian Caribbean and the Caribbean Diaspora, Essays on Migration, Identity, and Literary and Cultural Representations. And while I'm not sure about a lot of things, I was very sure about the first part of this title, The Asian Caribbean and the Caribbean Diaspora. And I remember discussing it with one of the contributors, my collaborator, my friend, Sue-Ann Barratt. And, I remember asking her about it and she was like, she wasn't too sure, but I was completely sure of it. And I just want to read something from what I wrote in the introduction. And I write, to historicize the Caribbean and the movement of Asians to the Caribbean space, it is to speak to the Americas and the indigenous peoples who were the first to be enslaved before the arrival of the Africans. Europe and the arrival of invaders who used violence to subjugate and quote unquote civilize. Is to speak about Africa and the legacy of African slavery. More than 12.5 million Africans were enslaved and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Only 10.7 million arriving to ports and plantations in the Americas. And of course, it's to think about and speak about Asia and the movement of, free labor to the Americas as replacement for supplement to African labor. So we must consider these intimacies, right, which Lisa Lowe discusses in her 2015 work. A colonial inheritance of mixedness thus follows, including discourses which Barratt and Ranjitsingh, myself and my friend here, Sue-Ann, which we discussed in our 2021 co-author text, describe as foundational yet contentious, including hybridity, mestizaje, mestizaje, hibarismo, creolization and dogarization, to account for multiplicity and cultural exchange. So while this collection seeks to center an Asian Caribbean diaspora, which it does, it in no way positions an Asian Caribbean in isolation from the other racialized bodies and the processes which brought them to the Americas and the Caribbean. Processes within the framework of liberal personhood excluded them. So the chapters, in the collection are grounded in these histories of the Chinese who arrived in Cuba beginning in 1847, arriving in Trinidad in 1806, a failed experiment, and to the British colonies of Guyana and Jamaica and Trinidad again in the 1850s. It is grounded, of course, in the history of Indian indentureship and the arrival of Indian indentured laborers in 1838 to Guyana, 1845 to Trinidad, 1873 to Suriname, with smaller numbers arriving in other British and French Caribbean colonies. Is rooted in the history of Japanese migration to Brazil beginning in the early 1900s, and the arrival to the Dominican Republic in 1956. Is grounded in the history of the Javanese who arrived in Suriname beginning in 1890. In no way does it cover the length and breadth of Asian migration to the Americas, but it does center the Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and Javanese diasporas in the aforementioned spaces. And, looking back now, because foresight 2020, one space I should have, made sure to include is Haiti and Chinese, the rich legacy of Chinese migration to Haiti. But 2 summers ago, as I was working on this collection, I worked with one of my former students, Miliada Bazil. I'm not sure if she's on. And she completed a research project and presented on the Chinese in Haiti, and this research is available online, which I think everyone should go see this, research that she did. So the Asian Caribbean I should change my slide. Caribbean diaspora, it is descriptive while also countering a limited discourse on the Caribbean diaspora. At its core, it is a collection of stories of the transcolonial regimes that necessitated the movement of peoples across borders, stories of encounter on Caribbean plantations, and later migrations as free migrants compelled by immigration schemes and economic opportunity. It consists of stories of migrations and encounters in diasporic urban centers. Stories of lived experiences before and at the time of nation building, stories about families, tales, myths, memories, articles and objects passed down through generation, stories of return and homeland, stories of introspection, transformation, and finding self amid silences, stories of how Caribbean people create, write about, and convey meaning about these histories and themselves. So herein lies the strength in approaching the subject through an interdisciplinary lens, the chapters thereby providing an interdisciplinary perspective to the study of the Caribbean diaspora, and the Asian Caribbean in the Caribbean diaspora. And, this book would be nothing without the contributors. The book is 15 chapters long, with an introduction. And I just want to, just read out this table of contents and, and make mention of the contributors who bared with me for a long time, me and my emails, constantly emailing, so I of course, I wrote the introduction, then chapter 1, Nikoli Attai, who's here, Memory Archives of a Not So Distant Past, Kufunlan Dolio Attai, 1917 to 1985. Please bear with me. I think it's important that I do read these names and I read, the name of the chapters, title of the chapters. Then we have chapter 2 by Gaku Tsuda, who is in Arizona. And Gaku's chapter is entitled Japanese-Brazilian Ethnic Return Migration to Japan and the Reconfiguration of National Identities and Homeland Affiliations. Then chapter 3, Jean Lee, The Heterochronicity and Transnational Locality of Indo-Caribbean Gendered Modernities Within Diasporic Returns. I write chapter 4, and I'm so grateful for the Betty Lee Song Endowment Fund for allowing me to complete the oral histories in this chapter entitled Chinese Caribbean Narratives, Migration, Identity, and Belonging at Home and Diaspora. Chapter 5, Greg Robinson, The Failure of Japanese Immigration to the Dominican Republic. Chapter 6, Cristine Can, Unpacking Indo-Caribbean Through Intersectional Feminism in New York City. Chapter 7, co-authored by my friend Suan, Dogala Maneuverings, Mixedness and Complex Embodiments in the Caribbean Diaspora. Chapter 8 by Sandrine Sukai, Echoes Across Oceans, Trans-Diasporic Indo-Caribbean Anthologies and Post-Amnesia, Jahaji by Bain. Chapter 9 by Tanya Diamanti. Where did history go? I asked myself if it could not be retold. Trauma and the Chinese-Cuban transnational history in Cristina Garcia's novel Monkey Hunting, 2003. Chapter 10 by Victoria Chang, Finding Home in the Diaspora, Roots, Reconnection, and Renewal in Joy Mahabir's Juve. Chapter 11, Homosexuality, Societal Expectations, and the Claims of Family, Queering Geographies of Domesticity and Belonging in Shani Mutu's Valmiki Daughter by Elvripides Kavrasilis. Chapter 12 by Jillian Ollivierre, who could not be here today, After Indo-Caribbean, Interrogating Interstitial Identities and Diasporic Solidarities in Conversation with Andil Gosain. Chapter 13, Creating Space, Migrations, Nationalism, Unity, and Cultural Diversity among the Javanese, Surinamese in Suriname and the Netherlands, by Rosamaren Hofter and Harriet Mingoon. Chapter 14 by Tarika Sankar. Tarika is here. Thank you so much. Chutney Songs, Indian Beats and Black Music. That's Digital Diasporic Consciousness on Indo-Caribbean Social Media. Chapter 15, the book ends with Leave the Door Open, Sounding Afro-Asian and Cultural Production by Aaron Joseph Dial and Melvin Earl Villaver Jr. This chapter on Silk Sonic, Anderson Paak and Bruno Mars, which makes real the possibilities for how we can further theorize and expand notions and imagine the Asian Caribbean. So again, this book would be nothing without the contributors on these chapters, so thank you all so much. So I am happy to have 3 contributors here with me, and soon you'll hear their voice as I'm that is me. This is our first contributor, Nikoli. I'm so happy to have you here. Nikoli Attai received his PhD in Women and Gender Studies from the University of Toronto, a Master of Philosophy in Cultural Studies, and a Bachelor of Arts in Media and Communication from the University of the West Indies. His most recent book, Defiant Bodies, Making Queer Community in the Anglophone Caribbean, was published in 2023. Attai's broader research focuses on queer experiences in the Anglophone Caribbean beyond notions of disease and violence and the need to flee the region. He also investigates international queer asylum interventions in Canada and the Netherlands and decolonial formations in Trinidad and Tobago and the Anglophone Caribbean. This work appears in several academic essays, and his forthcoming co-edited collection titled Free Up Yourself, Transgressive Bodies and the Contestations in the Carnivalesque will be published by Rutgers University Press in May 2026. Congratulations, Nikoli. I'm going to introduce your co-editor of Free Up Yourself, Suan Barratt. So Dr. Barratt is lecturer and head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, which I must add is where Suan and I, read for our PhDs. She's a scholar of human communication and gendered expression and interaction. Dr. Barratt interrogates gender-based violence, especially as it manifests through social discourse. In addition, she explores the nuance and significance of social identities, such as race and ethnicity. For example, through her most recent book, Dougal in the 21st Century, Adding to the Mix, which is our co-authored book. So we've been collaborating for a very long time as students, and now we're teaching the students, right? In general, Dr. Barratt's research extends to human communication conflict, gender-based violence, and child sexual abuse, social media use and its implications, mental health management and its implication for learners, gender and climate adaptation, resilience, and carnival and cultural studies. She's dedicated to building gender responsiveness and gender justice within society. And her forthcoming co-edited collection with Dr. Attai, of course, is entitled Free Up Yourself, Transgressive Bodies and the Contestations in the Carnivalesque. And Tarika Sankar, who I'm very happy to, we actually met virtually for the first time, right? We've been communicating for 2 years via email. Tarika Sankar is a critical scholar of Indo-Caribbean diaspora, race and ethnic studies, feminist studies, and digital humanities. She earned a PhD in English at the University of Miami and graduate concentrations in digital humanities and Caribbean studies. Her dissertation project entitled, and I should have been doing this all along. I'm sorry. Here you are, Suan. Here's your lovely photo and your bio. I do apologize, multitasking. And here, of course, is Tarika. And her dissertation project titled Beyond the Culture Concept, Indo-Caribbean Identity as Diasporic Consciousness received a Mellon ACLS Dissertation Completion Fellowship. Her collaborative and individual research has been published in the Journal of Indentureship and its Legacies and the Middle Atlantic Review of Latin American Studies. She is currently Digital Humanities Librarian at Brown University. So I just want to thank you all for, being here, joining with me and enduring me for 2 years or so. Our constant back and forth, trying to get this collection together. And I do want to start with Dr. Attai, start our conversation with Dr. Attai, with Nikoli, who I do know from University of the West Indies when we were students. So the first 7 chapters of the collection, they present histories and narratives of migration and return from the personal to political. They explore immigration schemes, diasporic movements, subjectivities, identity formations, etc. And, the book starts with your chapter, Nikoli. When I first read it, I'm like, we have to begin there, right? Memories. It opens with your chapter, again, a beautiful chapter on memory, migration, family, and home. And here we have what the chapter looks like. It is entitled Memory Archives of the Not So Distant Past, Kufun Landolia Attai, 1917 to 1985. And what I want to know is, and I'm going to stop sharing to reshare again later on, so I hope I don't run into issues as I reshare, is what inspired you to do memory work as you document in this chapter your grandfather's journey and life in Trinidad and China, these movements between, these multiple spaces. And what were some of the things you found out about your grandfather?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And again, congratulations on the book. I'm chuckling, because Suan and I, having just also gone through this process, I know how much stress it is. But it's rewarding work in the end. So congrats to you and all the authors. And, I'm just happy to be in this space to share. So my granddad died when I was about 8 months. So I never knew him. But through family stories, songs, food, disciplinary measures, I would always get an opportunity to imagine who this guy was, right? So grandpa, being Chinese, Trinidadian, born in Trinidad, was taken back to China by his dad when he was, the immigration documents say 9, but he may have been around 12. And that's even a question I start thinking about after around deception, right, in the archive. So, and would have stayed in China till he was 24, came back and met my grandmother, settled in Toko in the northeast of Trinidad, a predominantly Afro-Trinidadian community, right? So I would always, kind of over the years, be creating this image of who grandpa was, right? In the town, in Arima where we settled, my family will always point out where he had the first supermarket, where they lived, and even things. So again, like just creating these memories as I go along. And more recently, I started, working on some other digital projects, some other documentary type projects. And I had this idea, what, maybe I need to start interviewing my family, his children, to really get more of this picture, to think about how they remember him, what are the things that remind them of him. So I started interviewing them. And I guess the moment is always right, when we think about it in hindsight, right? So Aleah, I got this call for the book around that time 2 years ago. I think you may have sent it, Aleah, in our networks. I got this call. And then the day after, my uncle sent me grandpa's immigration documents, just randomly, right? He's also the little archivist in the family. So he sent me his immigration documents. I'm like, oh my God, this is a sign. I really need to do something with this work. And, I think I emailed Aleah immediately. I'm like, listen, this has to happen. I hope that I could put the chapter in and stuff. And it really became a moment where I could kind of start bringing things together. And so for me, I was, just excited that I could do it. But I was also a bit scared, right? Because as I write in the chapter, memory work, it's hard work doing this kind of archival work, especially with your family, in archives that are punctuated by trauma, by silence, by death. It's, really hard work. And as I write in the book, and so I was lucky enough to actually get a copy of the book yesterday in the mail before Aleah. So I just want to read just a quick part that I have in the introduction on page 13, where I kind of question the work I'm doing. So I ask, how might I sit with these archives? How must I engage with them in a way that truly honors the legacies that I'm being summoned to reveal? This is the sense of joy and gratification of being called to do memory work as an intentional practice of recalling, preserving, and interpreting personal or collective memories to understand their significance and impact on us. We must honor the dead, our ancestors whose stories must be cherished, and as the colonial feminist archival scholar Michelle Creswell reminds us, this work is slow and urgent, messy and strategic. It is imperfect, uncomfortable work. I'm haunted by these memory archives of documents and materials that preserve and serve as a repository of my family's collective memories, and the artifacts that are held securely in neat stacks, sealed boxes, forgotten piles, and fading recollections. And so we must attend to these items as we are beckoning and waiting to be recovered as we connect my Trinidadian family to China and many other lands along an illuminating journey. So I have an opportunity to really think about what this means in the family context, right? I have, just thinking, I have an image I would share just to kind of wrap up for now. Are you seeing, right? Right, so this when I think about my grandfather's journey, so having left Trinidad at 9 or 12, he would have made his way to Hong Kong via New York and Vancouver. So again, even thinking about other diasporas that he would have, and the networks that allowed that journey to happen in that way, and made his way back as well on the SS Ixon from Hong Kong back to Vancouver, then New York and Trinidad. But this picture, and thinking about the memory work I'm doing and the importance of family archives, the picture on the left, you see my grandmother and grandfather. The picture on the right, that picture was taken about 2 years ago in Toko at the shop that my grandfather once sold in. I'm standing, every time I go, I open it up and, just chilling it again and let these memories, some that I imagine, some that I probably make up, right, fill the space. But my grandmother is Indo-Trinidadian, the daughter of indentured workers who would have been made their way to Trinidad via Martinique. Again, and so this is another kind of part of the story, and also makes these kinds of Caribbean stories so interesting and so nuanced, right? So something I'm thinking about is how do I even continue building on this archive to think of my Indo-Trinidadian family, my Venezuelan family, my Vincentian family, right? And how these things collide as I continue doing this work. And to echo what you're saying, Aleah, we being knowledge producers in the Caribbean makes this memory work so important. And it reminds us again of why this work needs to be done.
Thank you so much, Nikoli. And again, a lovely chapter, on, memory and, what it takes to do memory work, right? And what I love are all of the archives, right? So the photographs, you have the postcards that your grandfather is sending to his mother in Trinidad. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? So
yes. So yes, and I should have mentioned that because when I started the project again, interviewing my family, I thought that that's where I was going to go. But while interviewing my uncle, he pulls out this container with files, and in it he hands me copies of letters that Grandpa would have been writing to his mother while in China. But they are letters he never gave her. He kept them safe in China until he returned. So again, all these questions come up for me about why he never sent them, the fugitive forms of writing and keeping in contact. And he would always say, from what I've been told, that he will never go back to China because of the racism and the ostracism he faced, the hard life he had. And so I think about all these things as well. And when I got these letters, I cried over these letters for an entire summer because of, again, it was a missing piece in the puzzle that I've been building all my life, right? But again, another important moment that really inspired this chapter.
Thank you so much. And it speaks to how personal the book is, right? And how personal writing, these chapters are for each of us. And I, with that being said, and we will have time for questions at the end, hopefully, I want to turn to Sue Ann And we co-wrote a chapter, Douglas Maneuverings, Mixedness and Complex Embodiments in the Caribbean Diaspora, where we explore the Asian Caribbean from the perspective of the mixed race Douglas, who is a Caribbean person of mixed African and Indian descent, and possibly any other combination of racialized ethnic groups which form part, of the historical and contemporary landscape of the Caribbean. And if you know me, you've probably heard me and Sue talk about Douglas many times before. And this chapter comes out of our our co-authored 2021 book, Douglas in the 21st Century, Adding to the Mix. And we begin this chapter with this anecdote of when 2024 Democratic Party presidential candidate Kamala Harris is accused of turning Black. That's where we start this chapter, right? My question to you is, how does someone like Harris, who has never described herself as Douglas in the way, but in any way, but she is the daughter of, of a Afro-Jamaican man and an Indian woman, how does someone like Harris, how does someone like her, right? And Douglas in the diaspora complicates, these notions of, these rigid racial and ethnic classifications. In the diaspora, how do they complicate it? And, could the Douglas ever be Asian, even though they are mixed with Asianness?
Okay, so I'll take it in order. Thank you so much, Aleah. Congratulations on this collection to all of the contributors and, of course, all of us coming together to produce work, as Nikoli demonstrated, that is both personal but deeply reflective and also revealing of our own capacity to produce knowledges often not accessed outside of our spaces, or whether it is at home or in the diaspora. From that point of departure, we complicated. Kamala Harris did well to complicate within the U.S. context, but all of us in our existence, particularly as Douglas or mixed or Caribbean, do the same thing. And I would say at 3 points. One would be from your very point of departure, which is about producing knowledge and knowables. The knowable not always perceived as knowable. We use the language of Douglas comfortably in Trinidad and Tobago, in Guyana, in Suriname, but that language does not step outside of that space unless carried by one of us and then translated and explained and defined. So this knowledge creates nuance. It creates notions of we're not caught up in single binaries of white plus black, but we're caught up in these intersecting binaries of so many things that we can be or have the potential for being. From that point, I move to the second one, the complication, which is around ways of being and knowing and our ontologies. Our existence then disrupts meta-narratives or big stories about who people are as Black, as brown, as Asian, as Caribbean, as Indo, as Chinese, as everything, as African. Because essentially, we in the Caribbean live, as Nikoli was able to demonstrate, these kind of complex, complicated lives that rest in our histories, both those that we are aware of, that were made knowable to us, and those that are not made knowable to us. And then from there, so we exist in this space of, I wouldn't say dissonance, I would say nuance and disruption and difference from the hegemonic, the things that we take for granted that we know as being existing, right? And then the third point would be, I would suggest a kind of politics of identification, of languaging, of saying things. You spent some time at the beginning saying the names of all the people who contributed to this collective work, which really couldn't come to bear, the Asian Caribbean and the Caribbean diaspora couldn't come to bear if we didn't do it in a collective way, as you have done so well. Because again, of the very things that I've mentioned before, the nuance, the complication, the variation. But that complication comes in the languages we choose to express ourselves. We choose to identify others and categorize people. And of course, that language is always political because it comes with varying levels of privilege or subordination or silencing or revealing or even discovery. And I'm speaking with excitement because, as you know, we've been contemplating this for a while. But as we contemplate it, we say, To be who I am shifts across spaces. We maneuver as we write together. We maneuver that sense of being. And in that maneuvering, not only do we complicate the fact that this is how race is defined, or ethnicity is defined, or citizenship is defined, or even phenotype is defined. In that maneuvering, this is how humanity is defined, is then complicated and complex. This brings me to your second question, which is quite, let's say, contentious and tenuous and almost disruptive for those who are asked it and those who are asking. The Dogra in particular is at once Asian and not Asian necessarily at all times. And that's a strange contradiction because, as we would have discussed, the Dogra, to be defined as Dogra, can be mixed with just about anything in a space like Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname, and other parts of the Caribbean, but must be touched, kissed by Indianness, necessarily so. And so that is part of your defining frame. However, the Dogra, because of that mixedness with African and because of this spectre of anti-Blackness, which I must mention, cannot then effectively claim Asianness or Indianness unless couched in racial accounting of mixedness and liminality. So yes, technically or denotatively, the Dogra is Asian because you are part Asian, whether it's half, quarter, three-quarter, whatever it may be. However, at the same time, the Dogra loses that kind of access because of the imprint of the other predetermining factor of Douglasness, which is Africanness. So yes, one is and is not at the same time. And one then has to counter that as the Douglas we spoke to, the Douglas we engage, by just being Dougla. That's their language. I'm just Dougla. However, just as how we, in our anecdote, we have outside of our Caribbean space, a sort of a public political encountering with that troubling reality. Oh, she has turned Black. No, she's always been there because she occupies these multiple ontologies of complexity. And yes, Dogra is not her language, but she is by definition, let's say, a textbook African and Indian. And so I think that it's really good for us as you contemplate the Asian Caribbean in the Caribbean diaspora, that we are constantly disrupting the boundaries that really don't exist, but we make solid through our everyday practice. So that's my offering for this point.
Thank you so much, Sue Ann. I do want to share what me and the sharing now, what the chapter looks like. I'm just going to leave it like that. Yeah, so we do start with this anecdote of, Kamala Harris. And, what we argue is that while many Americans were probably confused by Kamala Harris's mixedness, like we in the Caribbean, we live this daily, and that's why we started there. I'm going to move on to, thank you so much. So I'm going to move on to Tarika. And this is what, once my laptop shifts, this is what Tarika chapter looks like. And in the collection, the chapters are organized thematically. So the second set of chapters speak to literary representations of the Asian Caribbean diaspora and the ways in which Asian Caribbean people and their lives are written about or read through text. Then the third set of chapters move us to representations of the Asian Caribbean and Asian Caribbean diasporic subjectivities in artistic and cultural representations. And your chapter, Tarika, falls within that third theme. So I'm going to stop sharing. And your chapter is entitled Chutney Songs, Indian Beats, and Black Music, Digital Diasporic Consciousness and Indo-Caribbean Social Media. And in your chapter, you examine contemporary social media content and discourse by Indo-Caribbean online creators to understand the creation of what is termed a digital diasporic consciousness. And you argue that Meta's Instagram facilitates a connection and dialogue, that fosters this digital diasporic consciousness, while, also exposing these tensions between Indo-Caribbean as a racial ethnic category and Indo-Caribbean as a diasporic consciousness. So I wanted to know, like, how do you define the two? Indo-Caribbean as an ethnic, category, and Indo-Caribbean as a consciousness, diasporically.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for including me as well, and for ushering us through the process of getting the edited collection together, which is so much work. So the idea of Indo-Caribbeanness as a diasporic consciousness came out of my research, but also my lived experience of how the Indo-Caribbean identity is more or less an illegible type of identity in the North American diaspora. So in North America, so I'm talking about mostly US and Canada, in this context of how we conceptualize race here, we have Black, we have Asian, we have South Asian, and Indo-Caribbean does not neatly fall into any of these categories. And so there's sort of like in the diaspora, I see this like kind of rupturing and recreation process where it's like Indo-Caribbean does not fit into any of these categories of identity, and so it has to be reformed in some way, like reshaped. Because I really feel like the Indo-Caribbean as a racial or ethnic term, one, it's pretty illegible in the American context, and also, and I think this like resonates with a lot of what the other contributors and the other chapters talk about. For me, like being attached to this racial ethnic identity is what kind of keeps us locked in this binary opposition between Black and Indian, right? Because often when we think about identity that's premised on culture and traditions and sort of this conservative idea of like retaining what we brought from India and such, that's then slips into race, and that frames us as like Indian is opposite to African in some way. So that's why the concept of diasporic consciousness, which is more of like defining Indo-Caribbean is through this experience of multiple migrations, through the history of indenture, and just through an awareness of all of that, and also of an awareness of how Indo-Caribbean, it really ruptures the American conceptions of South Asian and also American conceptions of Caribbeanness, which is typically framed as Black. So what I was seeing on social media, which, social media isn't always the best space to have a deep and civilized conversation, but I found some spaces people were having really generative conversations where they were basically hashing out, like, what does it mean to be Indo-Caribbean? And they were contesting these ideas. And, some people were bringing more of this static racial ethnic idea of Indo-Caribbeanness to the conversation. And some were saying we're bringing what I call a diasporic consciousness, which was more of a politicized identity. It's an identity that challenges anti-Blackness, that's aware of the marginalization of Indo-Caribbean people in the Caribbean and in the diaspora. And particularly, I was always seeing this coming up on social media posts about music. Of course, music as like the flashpoint for national identity, for belonging, racialization. Like so many of these things come up around conversations around music. So, and then people in the discourse in these posts, when they're talking to each other in the comments, because it's all digital, the geographic boundaries don't apply. They're bringing in their context from wherever they're located. So if you're coming from the Caribbean context, you have kind of a particular idea about race, about Indo-Caribbeanness or Indianness, how that's conceptualized. You might not even use or resonate with the term Indo-Caribbean, if you're coming from the Caribbean, or with the term Asian. We could talk about that too. And if you're coming from the American context, you're bringing in American ideas and conceptualizations of race, and also the hierarchies there, and like the anti-Blackness that's present, and the model minority idea of Asianness. And so people were clashing around this, I think, because they were bringing all these different ideas about race to the space. So that's where I see this like tension. But I think it's generative, this tension of people negotiating and figuring out like what it means to be Indo-Caribbean. And I can talk more about the specific examples later, but the really controversial example was a post that was talking about all these genres of Black music. So it was saying like reggae is Black music, calypso is Black music, jazz is Black music, and then they included chutney. Chutney is Black music. And this was really controversial for some people, saying that, saying chutney is Black music, that's an erasure of Indianness, of the Indian origins of the genre. But I was thinking, like, what if we thought about Indo-Caribbean and about Blackness more expansively, and not as these like fixed racial categories that have to be discrete and separate from each other, but what if we think about Blackness as political, Indo-Caribbeanness as a political consciousness? Then that just gives us more room for those kinds of statements. But those who kind of subscribe more to like Indo-Caribbean as this racial, ethnic, culturally based identity were saying like, no, you can't say just that chutney is Black music. So I think I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about more of these examples on social media and how I see this like digital diasporic consciousness like emerging, but also being challenged by the more traditional conceptions of Indo-Caribbean identity.
Thank you so much, Tarika. Another excellent chapter in the book, particularly the ways in which you interrogate Indo-Caribbean, as a descriptor, as a consciousness, even this idea of if who we define as Indo-Caribbean people actually define themselves as Indo-Caribbean people. And just like briefly, I'm looking at the time because I do want to leave some time for some questions at the end and for us to talk a little bit among ourselves. My chapter 4, is entitled Chinese Caribbean, I can't even remember my own chapter, Chinese Caribbean Narratives, Migration, Identity, and Belonging at Home and Diaspora. And I utilize this oral history approach to share the stories of 7 Caribbean people of Chinese or mixed Chinese ancestry. And I did interview 9 persons, but I used the stories of 7 persons for this chapter. And I'm so grateful for, for the narrators, for the interviewees who, really, shared. And oral history, I love the method and methodology because, it allows for, marginalized voices, right, to very much, highlight their stories, to have these people also be, producers of knowledge, right? We're co-producing this knowledge together, right? The oral history process. But it's also a lot of emotional labor, so many times, hearing these stories, one person in particular, Stefan, who recalls, the bullying, he faced at a high school, in Trinidad, or, just, multiples, many, persons shared, and as Nikoli had mentioned, like trauma as well. But, I see what our work, very much interconnected because to talk about oral history is to speak of memory, right? As these persons, try to remember, and while I didn't do the memory work that Nikoli does, like I didn't analyze too much how these stories are remembered or shaped by trauma or age, which is, what memory work is truly about, right? It does, it is about how individuals interpret and give meaning to their past experiences in the present, and of course, their memory. And like Suan, like what we did in our work, I was very interested to see how Caribbean persons of Chinese and mixed Chinese ancestry, how they also maneuvered. They maneuver race in the United States of America. They maneuver race, racial discourses, Chineseness, Blackness, mixedness, as well. And in the same ways, as Tarika explored how Indo-Caribbean identity defines itself in relation to South Asian culture, and by extension, Afro-Caribbean and Black diasporic culture, how the narrators, that I interviewed, how they also define themselves, given, this US space, where racial discourses, and racial stratification, quantification very much differs than in the Caribbean. We do have a couple minutes just among ourselves. If we had questions for each other, like 10 minutes among ourselves. I'm not sure if anyone want to ask anyone something that's, not too complex given the time.
What are you saying? Are we ever anything but complex?
Are the most complex person asking?
I'm speaking for myself.
Yeah.
Any particular order? We just continue.
No, just, because we haven't, for 2 years, we've been emailing each other. We've been part of an email list, So we're seeing each other all together, at least 4 of us, out
Yes.
of, 18 people or so. And we do have a little bit of time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what I would say, sorry, Nikolai.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, what I was saying is that as I was contemplating preparation, I came up with different questions for each person because I was so inspired and enthused. But as we were talking, I in fact actually have one question that brings all of that together, just to simplify it. And that is, as you went through, Tarika, discoveries through these social media spaces where people would come into terms with themselves, Nikolai, as you went through that kind of memory making, historicizing, kind of evaluating how the past leads to the present, again, making sense of themselves, and of course, Aleah, as these narratives came through the oral history project, and then of course our own work talking to Douglas about how they see themselves in the contemporary. I wonder, what can we say about how people are encountering themselves reliably or not reliably as Asian, Caribbean, and the Asian diaspora? What are some of these things that you think people have never addressed, or they've put aside or minimalized, that we now can understand from the work that we've done together in the collection? From your perspective, of course. Complex.
Nikolai, go for it.
I think, this is kind of probably not answering it, but just sharing some thoughts. I think it's always inspiring and comforting when people have the opportunity to take pause, to think about themselves in relation to these kinds of questions that we're asking. Because oftentimes, again, living in these moments, right, where life is happening, like we're living in war, right, and especially I think in the context of work on memory and archives, so all we may have left is memory, right? And so I think having to take the opportunity to take pause in this moment to really document and conceptualize, to produce this knowledge, to hold this knowledge somewhere, right, that honors all these nuances, all these complexities, I think is really important for us now, right? And I think, like Aleah, I'm imagining even in your project with collecting these oral histories, again, seeing that emerging, right, in this moment. Social media as a space, again, where people are actively archiving and documenting their experiences. Because I'm thinking, I was just in Trinidad for Carnival, and it strikes me every time I go home, like you have to actively search during Carnival to hear chutney music, chutney soca, unless you're going to the events and stuff. Is not part of the national kind of mainstream festival, right? So I was, just reading a chapter, I was really struck by how social media becomes a space to really create an opportunity to, situate the genre and the culture and the history in relation to when mainstream media isn't doing it. So yeah, I'm just kind of thinking about these things as we chat together. Yeah.
Tarika?
Yeah. So the question, I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around the question, but things that are missing from the conversation that come through, kind of. Okay. Yeah, I think with the Nikolai, that's such a good point, is that social media can kind of be, like a term I use in the chapter, as a counter public, or like a counter narrative, where people can build their own narratives, but also I think sometimes they're reproducing the narratives that they've been given in the social media space as well. And that's what I really hope to draw attention to is even though we have this sense of like an entire diasporic community coming together, which is really generative, the geography behind that doesn't disappear, right? Or the way that your experiences are informed and shaped by where you're located, whether you're in the Caribbean itself or whether you're in the diaspora. So yeah, I think that's part of what I hope to illuminate, is like, we do have this idea that digital space is like this like open, it's like a flat democratic space, but actually we still bring those racial hierarchies, those national hierarchies, those identities and class divisions and race divisions. We are still bringing those into the space.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it back on to Gaston because I'm not sure if you want to ask us a question or we want to begin to open everything up to the audience for questions.
I will jump in with one question. Just a quick question, because I keep thinking about what this book is doing and the work it's doing in the world, right? And how groundbreaking it is. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about, the need for this volume, right? The need for gathering all of this vibrant work that centers Asians in the Caribbean and in the Caribbean diaspora, right? So what do you all find to be the work that your work is doing in the world, both intellectually and politically?
I see the Suan smile.
And you can start.
Well, for me, it's important to scholarship, because it significantly broadens, and revises how we understand the Caribbean diaspora, by foregrounding a Caribbean presence, an Asian presence, in the Caribbean, right? So it causes us to understand the Caribbean as very much multi-ethnic and this, interconnected diasporic space. And I think of like Nikoli's, grandfather and his family who moved from China to Trinidad, and then he goes back to China, by way of, was it like New York and Canada, and then returns, so it's very much this interconnected diasporic space that is shaped by, the transatlantic slave trade, but also indentureship and other later migration. And I think secondly, it centers these underrepresented histories and these stories. Myself doing oral histories, Nikoli and the memory work, Tarika is like searching through social media, posts. Suan and I, we interviewed 120 something odd, Douglas. Third is very interdisciplinary. I think that's why it was important for me to read through that table of contents from, first, of course, to highlight the great contributors, but also to show the interdisciplinary approach, which gives a very nuanced account, of, identity formation, migration, family, memory, etc. And it contributes to diaspora theory, I believe, complicating notions of homeland and return, was that 4 things? I listed up very quickly. As you can tell, I thought a lot about this, putting this collection together.
Yeah. Fantastic. And Suan, your hand has been up.
Yes. I put my hand up excitedly and quickly before my editor even had a chance to do so, because it is so interesting how things are timely. Yesterday, I was examining a thesis that came from an artist, and she was exploring the histories of essentially Dogla as addressed in Nigeria and India. I can't remember the artistic traditions that come straight to mind right now, and I really should, because it was just yesterday. But outside of that, what was interesting is that she made a point that I found most valuable to what we have now said, what Aleah just highlighted. And of course, that student will encounter this text very soon, but other students who are trying to understand. She had said to me in response to a question that the pre-colonial existed and can be used to reframe the post-colonial. And I thought that was an interesting, especially in light of what Tarika was saying and what this collection is most valuable. Of course, we're speaking in the context of Asian, Caribbean identities, realities, and all of the nuance that go with that. But as she said, when she was looking at art practices and art traditions, of course, of women from India and from Nigeria, because that's where her origins are in terms of her tracing her Dogla origins, is that there are these practices, whether we are talking about art theory and practice, or we're talking about people, or we're talking about traditions of home, that were then removed from our what we can perceive as real and re-inscribed with colonial narratives. And here it is, she's discovering through her work this collection, I think, brings together, as Aleah said, an interdisciplinary discursive look at that kind of reframing. And sometimes not even reframing, but actually framing in its originality because it wasn't framed before. So I was so excited when you asked that question, Gaston, because I remember the students so enthusiastically pointing out that most valuable kind of stepping up from history to present that the collection does so well, and then that can then be used as a real resource for students both in homeland spaces and the diaspora. And with that, I turn over to Nikoli.
Nikoli,
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I'm thinking about, again, the usefulness of the book. And like as you're saying, Suan, it's very exciting to see that students, that scholars, though producing this knowledge. We have a really good resource from the region that we could turn to, that will nuance a lot of the other scholarship that exists. I think the Caribbean intellectual life is an interesting space now with so much of us producing work, right? And even in the collection makes me think a lot about how this work is applicable to other diaspora contexts. So I'm thinking about even the work of like Dogla and stuff like how it may be applicable in places like Fiji, Mauritius, that has some similar migration patterns, right? Some similar contexts of colonization and indentureship and stuff like that. What it might mean for this work to resonate in those spaces. And so I'm excited about that. And it also reminds me of some work I'm doing with the Chinese Caribbean Scholarship Network and a symposium we had in Toronto in November last year at OCAD University, where we brought Chinese Caribbean persons from around the world. We had people come from as far as Sweden, China, Suriname, all over. And again, it reminds us that our work it resonates, and so we have so many connections across spaces, and that as people impacted by, again, the horrors of colonization and indentureship and migration, the trauma that these histories bring, and the kind of trauma we hold, this work is so important, right? And I saw that at that symposium in Toronto, where again we had academics, artists, creative writers, everyone exploring these themes, right? Just like we do in this book, and we find ways to relate to each other across disciplines. I think that's the beauty of a collection like this as well. We could, at one point, we're reading about social media, then we're reading something more academic. We're reading about archives. We're reading about Andal Gosai's curatorial practice, right? His art and memory and stuff like that. So I think it's just so exciting. I think you're muted, Gaston.
I said, Tarika, if you wanted to jump in on this, and then we have some questions already on that.
Sure. Yeah. I'll just say very briefly. I think it's really important for us as Caribbean people to be shaping the narrative about the Asian Caribbean and to be producing the scholarship. Because if we don't, then those who, aren't part of the community may do that. And Asian scholars and non-Caribbean scholars will probably get interested in this at some point and be doing scholarship, which is not a bad thing, but I think it's important for us to be centered as as Aleah was saying, as the producers of knowledge.
And I do want to shout out the people who have been doing this work. So persons like, Dr. Walton Lookley, whose book I carried with me for 2 years in my bag, in my book bag. So, shout out to all the Caribbean scholars who have been doing this work and who have, laid, the groundwork for us and paved the way. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. I do want to point out a couple of things. There are some congratulations and flowers in the comments, so make sure you take a look at it. We do have a question. I'm going to go to that in the chat, and then if you have questions in the audience, either raise your hand and we'll call on you, or write it in the chat. The first question says, does diasporic longing ever fade? And how would you feel if it hadn't shaped your life or wasn't part of it still? I asked as a member of a diaspora that started 400 years ago, Huguenots. I'm wondering how the more recent diasporic experience is opposed to my far removed experience, fundamentally different as it may be. The question about memory, history, diaspora, and time.
I mean, like I wrote in my introduction, I guess I wrote it, so it's printed and it's published, that, us as from the Caribbean or the Caribbean diaspora, we may not all long for diaspora as others may do. I wrote it.
Can you say why?
Wants to pick up on that point. Given the Caribbean as a diasporic space as well, right? Remember, part of the African diaspora, the Indian diaspora, given that, for us, many of us, it is that far removed, right? Given theories of creolization, which is one of the more popular theories to describe, Caribbean societies, right? This mixing and melding that you may hear people say, particularly in Trinidad, where I'm from. So myself, Sue, and Nikoli, from Trinidad. Tarika is born to a Trinidadian and a Guyanese, right? So we're all Caribbean people here. But in Trinidad, and Sue and Nikoli could correct me if I'm wrong, I've heard things like, like you're not Indian, you become Trinidadian, right? And I think that was also one of the, processes of like nation building, right? That our identities become subsumed under, a nationality. So they may not be belonging, in that way, again, giving the same way that the person who asked the question is removed. But I want to pass it on to my co-presenters. Like, the question is, does it fade? I don't think we all long for it in the same way.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking about, again, like being the subject of diasporas. And I feel as if there's always this longing for home, wherever home is. And I'm reminded of a really beautiful installation in the Bahamas on Clifton Hill, where after one of the hurricanes, may have been one a few years ago, not the most recent one, some tree stumps remained. It was actually the site of a slave plantation on a hill, on a cliff. And the artist, I can't remember his name, but he carved these sculptures out of the trees of these African figures looking in different directions. Their heads are wrapped, and the installation is called Longing for Home, and they're all looking in all different directions, and it really illustrates the horrors of migration that we're the products of, right? Like not knowing where home is. So I'm thinking a lot about that, about your question in terms of diasporic longing, where many of us because of, again, the silences, the trauma in the archive, how complicated memory is, how fragmented our memories are, where do we look, right? Many of us can't turn to a specific place, right? I often think of myself as well, living in Trinidad for most of my life until my 20s, 18, 19, then, but having lived in Canada for 12 years, now living in the US, and negotiating myself in relation to Caribbean diaspora, depending on where I am. Like in a space like Toronto, it's easy, right? I was living in Scarborough in the East. I step on my door, I see a Trini, a Grenadian, a Bajan, Jamaican. It feels easier for me to understand myself as part of a diaspora, as opposed to when I was living in Colorado, Northern Colorado, me alone, like running up to the first Trini I see after months. But again, so this longing, I think, shifts depending on our relationship to diaspora and to the histories and so forth.
Yes, and I would like to just jump in. Thank you for your question, Gaston, and pick up on what both Aleah and Nikoli said and say that I think we exist as Caribbean in layered diasporas. So what happens is that there's this kind of deep-rooted longing that is always simmering. It's always there resting, but let's say in the forefront of ourselves, in the forefront of our mind, that longing it can be dampened, or it cannot even be as present in our consciousness. I wouldn't say it is of the subconscious. I would just say it's just simmering, subliminal. Why do I say so? Because of this layering, we find ourselves contending with multiple notions of home, and that kind of home across the board and finding home across spaces. And as Nikoli said, I have never lived in the diaspora, so I was waiting and I was trying to make sure I understood. But I remember taking a trip in 2010 11 to Boston, and I was walking with another Trini friend just for a conference. And there was a young man who was walking right behind us. And then after a little while of walking, and we were being, of course, very cautious because we were like, why is this man following us, in this place in the great USA, right? But he paused for a minute, slightly emotional, and said, "Oh my God, are you all from Trinidad?" And we were like, "Yes." And he was like, "Oh my God, I'm so happy to see you." And I think in that moment, you could see that longing for home, that home being Trinidad, but the home could be something else as well. It could be some notion of origin. Or, for example, we went to, as Nikoli mentioned, the installation. I remember visiting a plantation in Barbados while I worked as a journalist several years ago. And as we enter that space, you experience almost a spiritual experience of rootedness and disconnect from that rootedness. And people started to cry and people of, different ethnic backgrounds, all from Trinidad and Tobago or Barbados or Jamaica. So I would say that longing simmers, but because of the point that Aleah made, that longing is not necessarily always most salient at the front of our mind because it's so layered.
And because of the legacies of colonial violence, Yeah. And I'm looking at the time too, so I'm not sure if Tarika wants to add.
If there are other questions, we could take those. I don't want to take up the time.
There are a final question in there, either in the chat or you can raise your hand. Annette.
You're on mute. Yes, I have a question. So, how hard is it for you to form an identity, to know who you are? Because you're living in America and you are being judged. So you have this Asian heritage, but in America, you're being judged by your skin color, your hair texture, and things like that. So how do you form your own personal identity out of that? I would think it would be difficult. You sort of split.
I mean, I think because, as Suan was saying, our the Caribbean identity, the Caribbean experience is so layered. It's hard to be legible out in these spaces, right? Like I'm taken up as a black man with a long rasp with an accent like this once when I move about space. And oftentimes out here, like it's hard for me to articulate, okay, like my family mix-upness, like the color that I am. Like to speak about my Indian grandmother or my Venezuelan great-grandfather or my black Vincentian grandmother, right? And the indigenous family I have somewhere in between, right? So I agree. It's a interesting, complicated experience navigating identity.
Yeah.
And actually, I was talking about in my class today. We were talking about identity and the ways that identity politics don't work for many of us in many spaces. And for me, I think like understanding myself and our communities come through kind of the things that our activities, like being a Caribbean person, being a Trinidadian in a space like this. And for me, I think that's more important for me as a way to exist in these very volatile contexts that we live in today.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any others? Or final comments on reflections on that question or on any of the topics that we have raised or that you have raised for us?
I feel something Tarika was saying, it's buzzing somewhere there, but it slipped me. But so I'll probably message you when it comes back to me after. Right. It was about how you say Latino is important that we write our stories. Is articulated by us because when other people write it, right? If it's written by other people, as has been the case historically when you look at anthropologists and all these things. So yeah, I was just thinking about how we're at this moment where I think more and more people are interested in curating our own stories. I think this book is a perfect example of it. And the necessity for this work, right? Even across fields. So I'm hopeful that, this book inspires other fields to really take a similar approach to center these hard conversations, these difficult stories and stuff like that.
And that's, I think, part of the important work that the book is doing. We do have one question in the chat.
Mhm.
And if and we got a couple of minutes, but yeah. So the question is, where can we go in New York or anywhere in the U.S. to learn more about Asian Caribbean culture? And I would say this book. Start there, right? Or any cultural landmarks or events. So quick responses, and then let's go.
Yeah, I wanted to jump to this question because it connects to the question about diaspora longing for me, because my favorite place to go in New York is like Richmond Hill and Ozone Park in Queens, as like I see it as like the heart of the Indo-Caribbean community. And so being born in the States, like I actually never lived in the Caribbean. I never called it home necessarily. So when I think of home and like the place that I feel I most belong, it's actually there in Queens, in South Queens, like among the other Indo-Caribbean diaspora in the US.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, if you're willing to make a hop across the border, go to Toronto, you could go to Play the Record, you'd see a Chinese Trinidadian still selling vinyl and CDs and all these things in Chinatown. You could go down to King Street and find the Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese merchants selling cloth, right? So those are spaces. When I lived there, I would go there, and they remind me of home so much. Like, again, just being able to walk in a fabric store and people sound like you. I have a friend, she's Chinese. She's actually Chinese, but grew up with Chinese Trinidadian people. She has a restaurant. Yeah.
Any other recommendations? I just, Nikoli, Sue-Ann, Tamika, of course, Aleah, thank you. Thank you for the gift that is this book. Thank you for the work that your work is doing in the world. And thank you for letting us learn from and with you. And for everyone who joined us, get the book, read it, enjoy it, learn. And thank you for being here and building community by learning together. Thank you so much, everyone. Good evening to all.
Good evening, Annette.
Yes, hold on a minute. Hold on a minute. I'm just finishing class here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Good
Bye-bye,
evening. Thank you,
everyone.
everyone. Bye-bye.
And you're continuing to get flowers in the chat, so make sure
I
that you
need to
take a
look at the chat. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to my colleagues, who are here, and to my students. Thank you all so much.